I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I have joining me regular appearing guest and friend Chris Temple of the National Investor. Welcome back, as always, Chris.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's we're finally into April. In Canada, we had an April Fool's joke played on us, where the government raised our carbon taxes again. Which leads us to this week's big topic that we're going to talk about: the elephant in the room, inflation.
Yeah, and it is an elephant in the room to hear some of the Federal Reserve officials down here say it. It's becoming increasingly behaved. Although, as I've mused in the last few days, I'm wondering if Fed Chairman Jerome Powell has not substituted the word bumpy recently for the failed word transitory, because for a long time, as we all remember, we were told inflation was transitory. It's here, but it's going to be gone quickly. That proved to be spectacularly wrong. And so the Fed is, as a result, jacked up interest rates for a year and a half or so and started to shrink its balance sheet to try and do away with that transitory inflation. And when most of the rest of us see inflation having reversed, but stopping at a point well above the Fed's 2% target and now starting to move back higher again. Now, the word that Powell is giving us again as recently as yesterday, Wednesday the 3rd, depending on when you're listening to this, folks, but at Wednesday the 3rd, Powell gave a speech and said, well, we think we're on the right track, but inflation's decline has been bumpy. So bumpy is now the word that is going to end up being egg on her face not too many months down the road.
I don't even know how to. That's a new economic term on my end. I don't recall that in any of my textbooks. Bumpy.
Neither does anybody else, but that's what we're getting right now when the Fed is trying to massage market expectations, which is starting to get ridiculous. I got to throw in with something that Jim Cramer said on CNBC this morning, and he's a bit of a goof. He's the Bobcat Goldthwait of financial TV. Those that know who that Canadian comic is will get the joke. But Cramer was even saying, and I'm paraphrasing, these people should just shut up. Why do we need six Fed heads every day giving a speech and having a opine on monetary policy, especially when one is telling us something different than the other? I mean, if you listen to Raphael Bostic from the Atlanta Fed, we might get one rate cut this year. You listen to some of the rest of them, we're going to get three. You listen to Powell, and he's not quite sure about three anymore, but he still insists that at some point later in 2023 or 2024, we will see rate cuts begin. So we'll see. I mean, the Fed has been playing catch up for a long time. They badly undershot as inflation kept rising during this transitory stretch. And then they had to catch up and raise rates way more than they had said. And my suspicion still is, especially if they do the right thing, that they're going to have overpromised this time as well, and that they're going to be forced to leave rates high unless there's an accident someplace or the markets rebel in a big way.
Yeah, that's my take on it as well. I had seen a stat actually this morning that suggested that the market right now is only factoring a 2% chance of no interest rate cuts this year. And I think the market itself is over ebullient as to the fact that they're going to get their three. Up to a month ago, I think they were still thinking there was going to be four cuts this year.
That's about right. And then as of this week, there's now priced into the Fed funds futures market slightly less than three. It was 67 basis points officially as of yesterday. I didn't see a number today. So that tells you the Fed funds futures market has somewhat come around to the understanding, and I think the reality, that the Fed is going to find it very difficult to lower rates when inflation is rising again. Next week, the week of April 8th, we get a new round of numbers where it's virtually certain that at least on the headline, they're going to be showing further rebounds to higher numbers, largely because of the increase in fuel in the last month. Whether that's mitigated by anything else, I don't know. Maybe the core still stays behaved as the headline number goes up. But, that'll make Powell's bumpy thesis that much bumpier, and we'll see how long they get away with this narrative. But a lot of things have been baked into the cake, which is what we really want to dive into today, Mike. That inflation is here to stay, and it's here to stay at a much higher, chronic level than we got used to over 40 years of disinflation.
No, I would agree with that. Like, as we're recording this today, I jumped online just before we started to check on the oil prices, and yeah, they were off a little bit today, but Brent oil was still $89 and pushing $90 again. And if you look at energy prices, they literally ripple through every single element of the economy. So if you have high energy prices, you're going to have higher food prices, higher heating costs, higher transportation costs, higher costs of production, because the electricity that goes into that production is probably coming from fossil fuels. And you've got governments that have declared war on fossil fuels, which are keeping those prices inflated.
That's right, and that's just one of many reasons why we're going to see this. But when you go to its core, folks, as the late Milton Friedman famously said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and maybe the always and everywhere is too absolute a statement, because you can get, as Mike just said, with uh, energy prices, sometimes government policy will exacerbate cost increases because you create shortages sometimes, or in the alternative, maybe too much of certain things. But at its core, the reason that we have in the last 2 or 3 years 40-year high in consumer prices is because the Federal Reserve, in purported response to the whole COVID pandemic and shutting down the economy and having to print money and so forth, created roughly 30% of the US dollars ever brought into existence. And they did that over the course of 2+ years. You don't do that without having costs across the board go up. So, as you know, I'm not the biggest fan of the doddering, half senile fool that we have as president down here. But this is where people that just want to, blindly put it on Biden. And I tell people all the time, Biden's not the Fed chairman. Okay, he's complicated things and caused worse inflation for consumers with some of his energy policies and things. But as a first matter across the board, everything goes higher because of cheaper dollars, thanks to the Fed. And as I said a few minutes ago, the Fed is trying to belatedly clean up some of this, but they already let the toothpaste is out of the tube. And one of the astonishing things right now, and this is one of the parts of the quandary that the Fed is in, you still have, when you look at long-term growth of the broad money supply, we are still, even after 525 basis points worth of rate hikes, even after the Fed has reduced its balance sheet, I think it's $1.5 trillion, give or take, from its peak, we are still above the long-term rising trend that we had before it went parabolic, thanks to the Fed over COVID, number one. Number two, in the last 10 months, the broad money supply has been rising, even as the Fed was nearing the end of its rate cuts. I think there were still one or two more that it pulled off during that time. So you may remember, Mike, that in December, to kind of set the tone for the year, I said, if you want to understand markets in 2024, you need to understand three words: supply, supply, and supply. And the fact is, and one of the reasons why inflation will stay elevated, will stay chronically high, is because the Fed really didn't yet clean up all of the excess money, even after all these rate hikes. You've got record issuance of corporate debt, whether fresh or by refinancing. You've got animal spirits still in the market. The increase in the median home price in the U.S. is still up 5% year over year as of this month. And all of these things have happened despite all of this alleged monetary tightening. So it really goes to show that, while in an absolute sense, going from essentially 0 to 5% plus interest rates and from 3% on a 30-year mortgage to 7.5% or whatever the peak was, it seems like a big deal. But in the grand scheme of things, when you look at what was first put out there as far as money printing, it's like emptying a bathtub with a thimble. And that's one of the reasons why, of many, that inflation is staying up.
Yeah, well, I have a different take on the interest rates because historically, if we take into account the way the world used to be, the average interest rate from the Fed was generally around 6 to 8%. So we're even, everyone's screaming these are high interest rates. We're still below that. We're still below average in what the interest rates, were on average. And if you take a look at the inflation rate, over the last few years and averaged it out, we're still below what the inflation rate was averaged out over the last couple of years. And you can't fight inflation unless your interest rates are higher than inflation. So it's not a surprise to me that inflation is not gone away, and and we're still going to be, to coin the Fed term, bumpy.
Well, yeah, and picking up with what you said too. I mean, nobody on their bingo card when 2024 started had zero rate cuts. And like you said, and I saw the same statistic, I think there's a 2% probability in Fed futures markets that there won't be any rate cuts at all this year. And that 2%, I think, has got a better chance of being right than 2%. Okay. But um, you look at that and you look at the, uh, I think another thing that people aren't contemplating, and of all the crazy things, I heard Powell even allude to this himself, which I found rather startling. And I heard, and I don't remember if you were in the room at the time at the New Orleans conference last year, but Peter Bukvar and Jim Urio both were seconding one another on the notion that once the Fed starts to lower short-term rates, the long end is going to rise. And don't be surprised if you see the yield curve steepen substantially, the Fed cutting rates to try and give some relief to markets. But just because of the overwhelming amount of supply of Treasury debt and still high inflation, you could see them lower the federal funds rate to 3%. And yet, 10 or 30 years, you're going to be looking at 6 or 7%. And nobody's got that on their bingo card either. But by rights, that's what should happen. And it won't shock me if it does.
No, it wouldn't shock me either. There's an awful lot, and this goes to government mismanaging their debt. Even there's an awful lot of debt that's got to roll over here in the next 2 years. So as much as we suggest that the Fed should probably still be raising rates, I got to think that they got to be loath to do so because of the government debt that's rolling over and having to be refinanced at a higher rate.
Well, that's true, and I've suggested to you before. I know, and I don't know at what point the damage is going to be so acute because there has been a roll off in the amount of overall Treasury debt that foreign entities own. So there's not as much help to the Treasury from foreign buying as there was once upon a time as a percentage of the entire market. So what does the Fed do? Does the Fed more overtly monetize some of the debt like they did for a long time in Japan? Well, they still do for that matter. Or what? I mean, I'm one of those that has suggested that, hopefully before a full-blown crisis comes, you will probably see, and I mentioned Japan, you will probably see the Fed and or more so the Treasury effect some type of a yield curve control regimen where not only on a short end where they can set rates, but even at the long end, they will do whatever is necessary and require the Fed to monetize however much is necessary to make sure that they peg long-term rates at a certain level. And that's not without precedent in US history. That was done actually for a period of time after World War II, for a variety of different reasons. So it's not like it can't happen, and not like it really won't happen. But what that will mean for the broad economy is not encouraging, because in the broad economy, especially when it comes to corporations and individuals, you will not have such an overt setting of interest rates mandated by law. It'll be done where Treasury debt is concerned, but that won't ripple down to everything else. So you could have a two-tiered system where, and not unlike what we have today, but it would be a more official one, where Treasury debt is sold at a certain coupon, and you must settle for that, like it or not. But when it comes to corporations, you'll have to pay up a fair bit higher above what that set rate might be from the Treasury for Treasury paper. And if you're bad credit risk, a junk rated corporation or something like that, you're really going to be paying through the nose. So that'll have, interestingly, if the Fed does have to do that, and if the Fed and Treasury in unison, however they pull it off when you get down to the details, if they have to do that kind of a thing, pegging a lower interest rate for Treasury debt will actually have pretty nasty consequences longer term for the broad economy and what the cost of credit will be there for what's left over that the government's not gobbling up. So we're not at that point yet. Maybe won't be for a little while yet, but that's one of the possibilities down the road.
Now, do you think that could actually happen? Because everyone starts to chase, return, and if the corporate debt is higher than the government debt, would they not just simply buy the corporate bonds?
Well, some people will, but also keep in mind that where the Treasury is concerned, there are a number of fiduciaries that are required to hold X amount in fixed income generally, and of that X amount in Treasury debt specifically. And this, with insurance companies, it's for some actuarial reasons and reasons over benefits. Same is true when it comes to some pension funds and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, there will be people that say, well, why, if inflation's 5%, in perpetuity, if we're lucky, why do I want to settle for 4 or 3 on Treasury paper when I can buy a midstream ETF and get 8 or something like that? Well, individual investors can and should do that. You should be doing that right now. But I think there is going to be, however this comes about, a squeezing out of credit in the private sector. The alternative is for the Fed, as they lower interest rates, to start goosing the money supply even higher again, and then we have broader based inflation that becomes really set in concrete. And that's what they're trying to avoid. They're trying to pretend that's not the road that we're on, but there's a lot of signs that that indeed is the road that we're on.
Yeah, it's, you look at it and you see the need to keep the interest rates in check so the government can pay its debt. And yet you've got inflation that is continuing to spiral. There's that concept of inflate or die. What do
Well,
they pick?
yeah, I mean, and look, a lot of people have complained, particularly if you're a partisan Democrat, that President Biden is being unduly judged in an unduly harsh way in the polls over his handling of the economy. And of course, they come out with their sound bites. Well, look, inflation is down 60% from its peak or something like that. And that, that's like a guy firing a revolver into your body, 6 shots, and he manages to pull one of the bullets out and says he helped you. Okay, so the thinking people aren't buying that. But Larry Summers, the former Democrat Treasury Secretary, a while back, they did this study at Harvard that I wrote about in my recent newsletter, and he said, well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why Biden is doing so badly in the polls. It's because the average American has experienced a cost of living increase far in excess of what the government's statistics are. And in fact, he said that we didn't peak at 9 or 10%. We peaked last year at 18% annualized. If you look at the inflation formula that was changed only a few years ago. And so people aren't quite that stupid. They realize how much their own living costs have gone up. And, right or wrong, you blame the guy in the White House. Jimmy Carter infamously got the blame for the inflation and stagflation in the 70s for something he didn't do. That was already underway thanks to Richard Nixon and Nixon's Fed chairman Arthur Burns long before Carter got in the White House. But he got the blame for it because that's one of the ill effects of what Nixon and Burns did to the dollar and resulting inflation. That's when all of that hit the fan. And right now, again, even though he's not made it better in some respects because of some of his policies, again, Biden wasn't the Fed chairman. Jerome Powell is the one who is more responsible for this than anybody.
So let's go down a different rabbit hole here. We talk about inflation being a monetary issue,
right?
That there's too much money for too little goods. And then if we look at the actual American public, there is a good swath of them that says, how can it be a monetary issue? I don't have any money.
Well, for a lot of them, that's true. But again, that goes to what I just said a few minutes ago, that this massive monetary inflation that you're right doesn't trickle down to a big chunk of the public that's living paycheck to paycheck. The result of all that monetary inflation is that living costs have gone up. If you want to be generous, during the time that Biden has been in there, which coincided again with this unprecedented printing of money on the part of the Fed. I mean, you're talking about 30 to 35% average for the average household. It costs you 30 to 35% more to live today than it did 3 or so years ago. And again, regrettably, the average American doesn't know who to properly blame for these things. The average American doesn't understand monetary policy and how these things come about. And of course, the politicians take advantage of that. I mentioned Nixon a minute ago. Infamously, there was a time when I don't remember if Nixon was still in there, if it was Jerry Ford afterward, because Herbert Stein stayed on and served both of them as chief economic advisor. But Herbert Stein got blowback once upon a time when he actually accused American housewives for the inflation problem. They were too stupid. They didn't know how to shop for bargains more wisely. And that went over like a fart in church.
I was going to say, yeah, that was a good plan.
Yeah, but this is how little respect that leaders have always had for the hoi polloi. They're not going to tell us that what they've done to cause inflation problems. Biden, the first big surge in energy when the proxy war with Russia started, it was all the Putin price hike. Well, now what is he doing? Shoving more money to Ukraine so Ukraine can hit Russian oil refineries and drive oil up $10 recently. Well, who's this latest hike on? And it's a hike, I should say. If you folks missed the news just this week, that was enough that Biden has now abandoned his plans to start refilling America's strategic petroleum reserve because now oil is too expensive again. So this is where some of his policies have gone beyond the Fed and made the energy part of the inflation thing worse than they would have been already.
Yeah, it's it's the same as I said. In Canada we had a nasty April Fool's joke played on us, where the carbon tax went up again, and that's a tax on energy, and it
Well,
goes
sure.
rippling through the whole economy. And of course, the federal government soft pedals the actual true effects it has on the economy.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, here in
and
the US, and the most recent one just went into effect, that fast food joints in California, if you folks have been following that news in the last few days, but when you raise minimum wages. And I have to say that I have very mixed feelings about that whole issue, but it's because if I had my way, we wouldn't even have the kind of monetary and economic system that we do these days. But that's a discussion for another time. Regrettably, we have what we have, and in that context, what happens when you raise the minimum wage is that costs go up for everybody. Inevitably, that's going to start to lead to demand destruction. So a lot of people that get that new higher paycheck, a few of them are going to lose their job because the employer can't afford it. The employer tries to raise prices to compensate for it, and sells less hamburgers or doodads or whatever as the case may be. And so, down the road from all of these policy actions that have exacerbated inflation, you will see more demand destruction, and this will all coalesce finally in more of a traditional recession one of these days. But right now, that has been a quote bumpy theme as well, to quote Jerome Powell. And the economy has not been downshifting all simultaneously. Some areas are still booming, but regrettably for the average consumer, um, things aren't all booming right now. And the biggest dynamic are these increased costs that have led already to some declines in consumption. And one of the things I saw just recently that I shared in my newsletter this week as well is that now you're starting to see some major resistance on the part of Americans generally to spending the amount of money it costs to go out to eat these days.
yeah, like I'm not the best person to judge that, because I don't typically eat in fast food restaurants. But I was floored the other day when someone told me like a Big Mac was almost $12. And I'm going, well, okay, the last time I was in McDonald's and had a Big Mac, it was like $2.50. So either that was a hell of a long time ago, or me thinks that inflation is run amok really a lot worse than I thought.
No, I mean and I watched the thing on the news last night, and they were specifically recounting the jump in the minimum wage in California for restaurant fast food workers and whatnot. But yeah, they were showing a typical garden variety, meal at a Burger King, the oversized, Whopper and the fries and the drink, $16.
Wow. I remember, I stopped eating fast food when I moved to Vancouver in 2001. And the reason for it, I had a very good colleague, and he and I like to find really good food that was very inexpensive. And the two of us could come up with way, way better meals than, at the time, like a, a general McDonald's meal was under $10. It was about $8. We could find way better food for our $8 at lunch than going to McDonald's. And that was kind of the end of me eating fast food. And to see it jump up to 16, 17, $18 now is, it's a bit jarring. And, if someone has a family, I could see where, you know, even the simple "we're going to make you D's" is just out of the question for them.
Yeah.
So going back to our original statement, where if inflation is a monetary issue and these people don't have the money, so inflation is becoming an issue for them, where is the money that's causing the inflation?
Well, the money causing the inflation is in markets to a great extent. This is something, of course, and this is also a discussion for another time to really dive into this properly. But Paul Volcker pulled off quite a feat during his time as Fed chairman, and it's not the one that most people remember or credit him for. And that is by corralling the double digit inflation of the late 70s that went into the early 80s. He jacked interest rates way up, and presumably everything came down. But what he figured out how to do, and this is the reason why Ronald Reagan reappointed him, was that Volcker enabled far quicker issuance of debt and credit accumulation and so forth than a second act that he had as Fed chairman. But with the help of some policy moves as well, the inflation in the 70s, which when you look at the growth of the money supply, accelerated dramatically under Paul Volcker in the 1980s, they were able to funnel that as a first matter primarily into asset prices. So, for example, the peak federal deficit when Jimmy Carter was president, he was pilloried for this, was about $40 billion. By the time Reagan left, it was 200 billion. By the time George Bush Sr. left, it was well over 300 billion. And yet, during that time, you had an epic boom in the stock market. Interest rates collapsed from their peak, and the published rates of consumer inflation also collapsed from what their peak was. And it wasn't because there wasn't money printing and monetary inflation going on. As I said, it accelerated dramatically starting under Paul Volcker in the early 1980s, but it all got funneled into asset prices. That enabled greater consumption. It enabled more spending on the part of businesses, consumers, and so forth. At the same time, this is why you had the move toward globalization, toward outsourcing jobs and so forth, because you were able to keep wage pressures down because a lot of Americans couldn't get wages going up because their jobs were being sent to China or Vietnam or Bangladesh or India or wherever. Okay. And you also had a lot of disinflation helped along with commodity prices, which peaked in 1980, 1981 timeframe because of the inflation of the 70s. But then those commodity prices came off the boil. So you had a perfect storm situation where all of the monetary inflation, or the great share of it for the better part of 40 years, because of those things, keeping wages down, lowering the global pressure on wages, lowering commodity prices, and so forth. It all went into financial assets, and it worked great. Yeah, you had the occasional bust, like in 2000 and like in 2008 when things got too stupid, but never did the rebound translate into enduring consumer and producer inflation. But it is again today, because a lot of the things that were these one-off policy moves going back 40 years, one by one, they've been dropping away. As I mentioned with the minimum wage laws in the US, now you've got Americans getting much higher wages. The political and economic imperatives have come around to that. The big one that still has not been fully felt is going to be the rise in commodity prices in the years immediately ahead of us, because here too, a lot of the factors that led to lower prices are gone. Not the least of which is the fact that we're not going to have a US centric world anymore, where the US and to some extent other major developed economies can command commodities at cheap prices. Now the owners of those commodities in South America and Asia and Africa, they want a fair shake. So you're going to see a whole set of circumstances lead to rising costs across the board for commodities going forward. And it really is going to be, in some respects, a more onerous form of stagflation than even what we had in the 1970s. And that's where we're at, and that's the table that the Fed has set for us. Even if Powell wants to pretend inflation, well, again, his word is bumpy rather than transitory now. Even if he wants to pretend it's bumpy, it's here and it's here to stay.
Yeah, well, let's go back to the term of the Orange Wonder. That was the beginning of deglobalization for all intents and purposes. So you've got all that industry that kept wages lower by being offshore to Asian countries. Now they're looking to bring those jobs back to America or friend shoring it to friendlier nations. The wages in those places are higher.
That's right.
So you're going to see inflationary pressures put onto product again, just by a reshoring or a friend shoring of this labor that's coming back to the West.
You're absolutely right, because deglobalization is going to galvanize these changes that I mentioned in the wage levels and commodity pricing and all of the inputs for producing commodities and making finished goods across the board. All of these costs are going to continue to rise. It was interesting this week as we're recording this. We had this rally in long-term Treasury yields that broke above a key level, and for a while it knocked the stock market down. But silver was still rising, copper was still rising, oil was still rising. And it's rather remarkable to see that. And it's only in the beginning stages, but I do believe the realization on the part of some investors is coming around that, if anything, if we see the broad stock market finally knock down a couple of pegs and be repriced more for this long-term chronic stagflation picture that we have, and it needs to reprice. As it does, unlike in the past, when that would also lead to weakness in commodity prices generally, we may see the opposite. Unless the decline in stocks was abrupt or caused by some kind of shock, then everything goes down in unison, at least for a while. That's going to happen. But it is interesting to see some realization start to creep into this, because I just talked to a mutual friend I mentioned before we got on and started recording today, and we were talking about some of this kind of thing. And I said, in 6 or 8 or 10 years, the average cab driver and shoe shine boy is going to be wanting to brag about the gold stocks and uranium stocks and copper stocks that they bought, and even some of the old energy stocks that they bought. Today, they're bragging about their Bitcoin and their meme stocks and their artificial intelligence stocks. And that's where we're going to be in several years down the road. So, and again, that you're right, that's going to be exacerbated by the move away from globalization. A comical thing this week, also on that front, was that Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, who and I mean, they all play for the system. Okay, they all play for Team Uniparty here in Washington and do whatever they're told. But aside from being a political shill, she's just is an academic matter one of the dumbest numbskulls that we've ever had in that kind of a policy position. Okay. And at a time when one after the next, you've got US centric companies pulling in their horns on the whole EV thing and this and that, she's threatening China, which is kicking the West's ass on green energy and EVs more than ever, despite everything that President Biden and she have promised. She's threatening China this week. Well, we can still come up with some protection against cheaper imports when it comes to green energy technology. And in China, they're laughing their asses off at her. What are you protecting? You didn't allow your own companies and your own mining industry and whatnot to flourish, to offer us any competition on electric vehicles. We've got this all figured out, top to bottom, on a supply chain. You guys are still fumbling around with woke platitudes as your energy policy. Hey, more of it. Reelect Biden. That's what China wants.
Yeah, and I was about to say, like last time I checked, we weren't buying any electric vehicles from China anyway. So I'm not sure, 100% tariff on nothing is still nothing.
Well, it is, and now some people know, and the Orange Wonder is one of his campaign issues. Has been talking about this, and not improperly, though. I don't think he's, as always, he's good at identifying problems, but the solutions sometimes are not well thought out. But he knows, as does everybody, that China has been setting up shop increasingly in Mexico, and so we're getting Chinese EVs and other things through the back door because they're being imported from Mexican subsidiary companies. Okay, well, Trump says, I want to stop that. I want to slap 100% tariff on everything. So that'll do wonders for inflation, right? Have more tariffs on stuff like that. Well,
Not
look,
not to mention the ensuing court battles
oh,
that'll happen in the world
it'll be
trade
nuts.
because it's
So,
violating the U.S. Marine Corps Free Trade Agreement or whatever, USMC or whatever it's called now.
well, it was USMC. Before that, it was NAFTA. But look, the way either one of them could fix this to some extent, and President Biden already showed that he's fixed it by making the problem worse in most respects, is that you make sure that you take the shackles off of U.S. industry, U.S. mining. You streamline the permitting and regulatory processes so that they don't take 25 years to permit a copper mine where you've already done the same environmental test 8 different times and fought off 7 associated lawsuits. That's ridiculous. And there's no way we will ever be able to compete with China or anybody, let alone bring any of this stuff back to the U.S. if we don't fix this. I mean, in Canada it's bad, but here it's worse. It's far worse in the U.S. There have been a handful of instances where the government has lent a helping hand or some financing to some development stage projects, but by and large, and this is laughable when you really go back and look at it, and you want to laugh yourself to tears because it's at the same time so tragic if you're an American citizen. Everybody made fun of Biden when he wanted to characterize this one boondoggle as the Inflation Reduction Act that had all of these rules and regulations and some alleged help that was going to come to parts of the green energy and EV supply chain. Ironically, if he had done the right thing when it comes to all of the different moving parts of green energy and whatnot, and we had larger supplies of copper and nickel and lithium and cobalt and all of these things coming on, guess what? You know what would have happened to the cost of a lot of these things if you had greater supplies of the raw materials needed? They would come down. And so, had the whole thing been done properly, the Inflation Reduction Act maybe would have been somewhat of an Inflation Reduction Act. But instead, what has happened recently, and I know you just had a discussion with our mutual friend Ryan Sistad about this, what has happened instead is that Biden had this working group put together to look at the old 1872 mining law and some of the associated regulations and whatnot. And while there have been a few high profile ballyhooed cases in the press of whether it's the Defense Department or whoever making some grant money available to some individual projects, in the bigger picture, they're going to make it longer and tougher to permit the average project in the US if they have their way. So much for inflation reduction and so much for us being able to build any more electric vehicles beyond what we've already seen, and so much for us being able to compete with China or with anybody else.
Yeah, the podcast I did prior to our friend Ryan Sistad was with one of my contributors from London, or actually Manchester, now the Isle of Man. He just recently moved. Ted Butler, very young kid, very bright, does wonderful research. And in spite of all the trillions of dollars that have gone into green energy, to bring it up, all they've managed to do with the fossil fuels and system is drive it from a share of 82% to 81%.
That's right.
So there's challenges there, and I'm not saying for a second that we're not better off if we can solve the green energy problem, and we probably would be as a society.
Yep.
However, old energy is here to stay until we solve this problem, and we can't solve it when, as Ryan pointed out, you can't have the Inflation Reduction Act succeed if you can't permit a mine to get to the raw materials to get to the factories that are going to build, the electric engines,
That's
as an
right.
example.
Yeah, and so that's why, or a big part of the reason why, in summing this all up for the folks, that we have a two-pronged inflation problem, and both prongs have galvanized a much higher inflation regimen going forward than we got used to from the early 80s to, around 2000, the era of disinflation for the most part. One is Fed monetary policy, which now they're going to be required to start stoking it even more before too much longer. They've gone about as far as I think they're going to get away with reducing the balance sheet. They're probably going to be forced by circumstances, political or otherwise, to lower rates even before inflation is down, and that's just going to add the volume of money and credit that's going to provide the fuel for greater inflation down the road from that monetary standpoint. And from the policy standpoint, all of the things are in front of us that still lead to shortages of all the things that we need for everyday life. And I'm this weekend putting out the first of a fresh series of special issues. The first one is going to be on old energy, and making the point with all of them that when you look at the projected demand globally for more energy of all kinds, it only continues to go up for as far ahead as you want to look. And that's what it's been doing for the last several decades. We do not have an energy transition, we have an ongoing energy addition. As a couple people I'm quoting in one of these issues has pointed out very accurately, and that also comes where it concerns fossil fuels. And people just don't stop to think that Bitcoin mining has been called out for the negative impact on energy demand that it's had. Not negative in the sense that it needs less; it needs vast amounts of energy. And so there was even a time when Treasury Secretary Yellen was throwing out this trial balloon to see if she could more greatly regulate cryptocurrencies on climate grounds, to say that this is a clear and present danger because of all the added energy input. That didn't go anywhere, clearly. She didn't win out on that, at least so far. And now you're going to have exponential increases beyond even that from all of the data centers over artificial intelligence and all these new computers and this and that and data centers that are being built. You have an even greater demand still for that, which is one of the reasons I think that one of the gifts of a lifetime, if you're an investor and understand how all these things are going to play out over time, is with a spot price of natural gas back under $2 here in the U.S. That's a generational buying opportunity, in my opinion.
Yeah, we haven't even solved the amount of extra energy we need to power the electric vehicle, fleets
Yeah,
that they want, and now we're going to add, artificial intelligence to that mix. The demand for energy is simply going to keep increasing, and unless there's something drastic done, at 81% of the market share, that means that we're going to need more and more old energy to power that. I'm going to leave this with my word of the month. I heard a new word, and I think it sums up everything. That new word was batshittery. And what I think needs to happen is that we need to get rid of some of the batshittery that's happening in your legislature and Congress in order so we can get plans to solve the real problems instead of the crazy that we're getting.
yeah. The average person has no comprehension, and especially the average person that has supported the current administration down here. And when you understand policy on green energy and fossil fuels alike, the long-term damage that has been done to the average household, to our national security, to our economic security. It's mind-blowing. We need a, I don't care if they're a different crop of Democrats or Republicans, or they call themselves kumquats or gerbils. Get some adults back in a room that have a real world understanding of everything from finance to permitting to physics to engineering. And let's start from the ground up to realize that we need to use all of these factors to figure out how we're going to meet our energy needs. You don't start with these pie in the sky platitudes that are totally unrealistic from economic and engineering perspectives and say, just we're going to will ourselves into this environment where we have a solar panel on every roof and an EV in every garage and daisies in the front yard. I mean, that has been blown to smithereens in the recent past. It's not like these things aren't attainable. It's not like I don't think that we should have more electric vehicles in the US. I do believe we should in the right context and with the right infrastructure. But the guys who've been in charge of that to this point have badly screwed things up, and we need adults back in the room. We need to get rid of the bat shittery.
Here, here. So if our listeners wish to avoid the bat shittery and get to some sane ideas, how do they follow you?
Simply go to nationalinvestor.com and make sure that you're on my mailing list.
Wonderful. Thanks very much for joining me again, Chris, and I look forward to having you back on again sooner than later.
Take care.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.